I've had quite a few people ask me how they should vote in this election. I think there's a lot of confusion, especially when the left and the right don't seem to necessarily all have it together in one party. No party seems to be perfect, and that makes sense because we're dealing with humans and no human is perfect. Voting is it's an imperfect science, and so we can just try to do our best. I don't actually have an interest in telling people how to vote. And in particular, as a coach, I don't have a particular interest in telling people how they should do anything. I do think, though, that it's important to share with people how to think about how to vote. Because if you can think through your process in a healthy way, it won't just help you for this election, but for every election going forward, in the same way that learning how to make decisions, how to think through things will help you in your everyday life. So here's a really quick overview of how I think when I go into the polling booth. And I encourage you to consider it. Feel free to write it off if it doesn't work for you. The thing about voting is it's not just about exercising our personal rights. It's also a responsibility to the rest of the country. And you're doing your dutiful service to the nation if you vote. When you vote, you are not just voting for your back pocket, you're voting for all the people in this country. And that will ultimately affect you, because if people are unhappy in the country, they will help to make your life miserable in the long term. But if people are happy, then it'll be a more productive country, and the society will be more cohesive. So I encourage you to think about the paradigm that you're working from. When you go to the polling booth, think about what is the sort of Australia that you want to live in the future. What would be the perfect Australia? See, if you're only thinking about your back pocket, you might miss all of the other things that make Australia a beautiful nation to live in and a beautiful society. So thinking about the long-term plan for Australia, what does that look like? And what does that look like for your children and your children's children? What's the infrastructure that would be required to build that? Or what do we need to be thinking about to make sure that people do get a fair go, or that there is equality, or that there is decent representation, or that people can afford houses, or that there is good infrastructure? Different parties are good at different things. Now, the second thing to think about is the process that you go through in order to achieve that. Now, when I'm voting for a leader, or when I'm trying to hire a leader for an organization, I look at two things. Firstly, integrity, and secondly, competence. Now, they might be very competent, but if they lack integrity, then they're not going to be working in the interests of the wider public. They're only going to be working in their own interests. Integrity is really asking the question of, will they deliver what they say they will deliver? Sometimes they can't deliver that, and that's unfortunate, but it just means that you can't actually trust them to follow through on what their promises are. At other times, they can deliver it, but it's a question of, will they deliver it? And so this is why the phrasing of this question is, will they deliver what they say that they will? If they can deliver it, but they have no interest in delivering it to you, then they're still of no value to you as a public servant. So that's your integrity. Competence is the other side of the coin. Can they actually deliver it? Can they get the job done? And will they get it done in a good way? It's not just that the end justifies the means, it's also that their process is a healthy one. They may be able to get a job done, but they may be a bully, or they may grease the wheels in unethical ways, all that sort of stuff. You have to weigh up what's most important to you. The other thing about competence is, can they get the job done in a sustainable way? because it's one thing to look like you are that you've achieved things within a 3 or 4 year political term, but it's another thing to have set up society to be able to survive long term. And it's important that we think about this, not only in terms of finances, although they're very, very important. You know, you don't want to be running up huge debts or having inflation in crazy ways, or the cost of living spiraling out of control. But you also want it to be environmentally sustainable. Can our planet maintain growth at the pace that we're maintaining it? Are there smarter ways to make this happen, or you know, or is being environmentally responsible going to absolutely cripple us financially? These are things to weigh up, and it's always a bit of a give and take. One of the things that some parties miss thinking about is this sustainable on a social level? We may be an effective economy, but if it rips apart our social fabric, then what's the point? The economy is actually there to serve our quality of life. And if our quality of life is being compromised in order to maintain the machinery that was designed to support our quality of life, then there's really no point in even pursuing it in the first place. So that's your process. How are governments going to operate on a day-to-day basis? And you know, that also includes things like, will there be a clear process that people understand so that they can feel they have ownership over the political system as well? And will there be a level of transparency so that we can understand what is going on? Because otherwise that compromises our perception of the integrity of the process. Also, part of integrity is the private lives of politicians, not just the public lives, because private lives, if they're not kept in check, or if what happens in offices behind the scenes that we don't normally see isn't kept in check, it compromises our opinion of the integrity of the entire political system. And then people get cynical and they get jaded, and everything falls apart. So it's actually really important to maintain that integrity, both in what's seen in the everyday, but also what happens behind the scenes. So that's the first thing, is the paradigm that you're working from and the long-term plan that you have for Australia. Second thing is the process that we go by. The third thing, the third level to look at is really about the final product. And so that's the competence of the delivery of services and the actual policies that are being offered. Now, in trying to decide what policies are important, there are so many, and it's so hard to keep track of them all and to know what all the different parties are offering. And it's not even realistic to just look at what's on the news, because there are certain parties or certain individuals who may have great policies but don't get airplay on the news because they're just not sexy enough for a soundbite. And so I think it's worth taking a look at whatever policies you think are important to you, and be aware of what else there is and what's being covered and what's not being covered. So here's how I look at what policies are going to take the most attention for me. I think through what are my values, and these should resonate with what sort of country I want to live in the long run. If I claim that my values are for equality and for inclusion and for sustainability and efficiency, but I make compromises because I've been promised that that someone's going to build something in my municipality, then what I'm saying is actually the higher values that I hold are about me getting what I want now, and I don't really care how things work for the rest of Australia. That's okay. If that's what's important to you, own it. But I think sometimes there are people who say that they believe one thing and they don't necessarily follow uh, through on all their values. So what are your values, and what are the key points that matter in that respect? And there are so many values and so many different policies that are on offer. And most of them are actually interwoven with each other. So where we push for one, it's going to mean that something else suffers, because we don't have an unlimited budget, and we can fight for all of our rights and our freedoms, but that also costs people in other ways. There are responsibilities and there are restrictions on rights for every right that we claim. So here are some of the things that may be of interest to you, and I'm not saying that any of them are more important or less important than the others, but the obvious ones are the economy and housing and border security, tax rates, education, arts and culture, those sorts of things. Thinking through each of these issues, I think it's worth giving each of them a score out of 10 in terms of importance to you. Because if something rates as a 0 out of 10 and you seriously you don't care what happens, then it's actually not really worth you spending a lot of time looking at that. But if something really, really matters to you and it's an 8 or a 9 or a 10, then you want to weight that score accordingly. And the way that I normally would do it would be say, I'll make a column of score out of 10 for how important is this to me. And the next column would be looking at each of the political parties. So I have a different column for each of the political parties or each of the candidates in my area, saying, how favorable are they to me in that policy area? So if there was a policy that I cared a lot about and maybe gave it a 9 out of 10, and I had they were presenting a policy that was maybe a 4 out of 10, then 8 times 4 is 32. And so their score out of 100 for that policy would be 32. Whereas if there's a policy that's, a 6 out of 10 for me in terms of importance, but they got full marks because it was a really good policy, then they would get a score of 60. 6 times 10 is 60. And so that's just a way that I would look at it and say, okay, so where are they scoring high on in terms of my particular vote? That is, and that's going to be different for everyone. That's going to be really, it's not for anyone to determine what someone else should vote for. But here's a list of some of the issues that I've come across recently, and I encourage you to think through them as you go to the polling booth. Feel free to write some of them off, and I will have missed some as well. And it's not a conspiracy. Please feel free to send me a message if you think that something's missing. I'm happy to add it on, and I may even post this list on the website and on the Facebook group. And these are in no particular order. Australian foreign policy or our international standing in relationships. And that includes with China, with the AUKUS coalition, our standing with France, our standing with Russia, all of these things. And also with the UN, with G20, all those sorts of groups. Our international standing is important. And that also includes things like defense and border security. That's a natural flow off from that. Thinking about border security We also need to think about immigration and our treatment of refugees. And we have to balance that with the economy. Obviously, having a good economic and trade policy is important. Having good debt, good levels of government debt, and hopefully not too high levels of government debt are important. Link that to tax rates and also unemployment and the cost of living. Looking at pay rates and minimum pay rates or job seeker rates and welfare payments. Then there's also hospital funding and health and climate and the environment. Do we have plans for all of these things? The schools and education are also an important thing. They're the future of Australia, and arts and culture. You know, this is important to different people to different degrees. Community cohesion. Do we have a really good idea about the sort of community that we're building, or are all the policies a bit sterile in the way they feed into society? Ultimately, I think, you know, if people feel like they're living in a really good community where people care about them, they are pretty happy. And even if the unemployment rate's a bit higher, well, if community comes in around them, then they may actually feel supported anyway. These sorts of things matter. Integrity and the accountability and transparency of government is another thing. We mentioned competence of government as well. Our levels of foreign aid and how things work in the context of global poverty. How much do we care about that? A lot of people would say, well, it's not our issue because you know, it's not within Australia, but actually creates a security risk if the gap in between the rich and the poor in any society, so that's internally within Australia or externally, if it gets too big, because it gives people incentive to overthrow the people who have a lot. These are things that we need to think about. Also, homelessness, social housing, affordable housing. These matter to people in terms of their basic needs and fulfilling their basic needs. The character of individual politicians and whether or not they ran an ethical and scandal-free government and whether they ran an ethical and a scandal-free election campaign. Diversity of representation within parties. It takes many ideas coming together to form wisdom. And if you don't have diversity of ideas, then you're not going to be picking the best ideas from a big pool. You're only going to be picking the best ideas from a small pool. And so you may end up with very unwise decisions. Looking at mental health, you know, how are we looking after mental health at the moment, especially in the wake of the COVID lockdowns? And in the context of housing issues and the cost of living issues going up, that all affects mental health as well. So they're all interrelated. Indigenous justice is another issue that has kind of fallen off the radar in this election. Privatization of utilities means that it doesn't really affect the rich so much, but it really does affect the poor in society. And so it contributes to the widening gap between the rich and the poor. Also looking at disability services, you know, that's part of our inclusion in society. And aged care, we have an aging population at the moment. Medicare as well is really important in that context because we've got increased needs that are weighing on the system, and we need a robust system in order to support the demand for services, both in aged care and in Medicare. Also, as we have an aging population, superannuation is really important. Will we have enough superannuation for when people retire? I understand that, you know, one of the aims of, or one of the policies of this election has been about allowing people to access their superannuation so they can buy a home. It hasn't actually addressed what happens when they retire and whether or not they're going to have any superannuation to live on. So it's a give and take, because they get the benefit of the home and they will have the increased value of their house going forward. But if they go bankrupt, they'll lose everything and they won't have any superannuation either. Which matters more to you, and which is of more of concern for Australia? Who has a strong vision for Australia? A leader needs to have a strong vision. And in the absence of a strong vision, people end up just trying to feed their own personal benefits and trying to stay in power at all costs, because they're kind of going round and round in circles with no clear direction. Freedom of speech, does that matter to you? And to what degree does it matter? And in what context does that matter? The handling of disasters. So we've had COVID, we've had fires, we've had floods, we've had economic busts. How do we look after people in that? How do we keep stability within the nation in that? And who will provide stability the best in those situations? Affordable childcare, a sense of fairness, looking at things like reproductive rights and euthanasia and freedom of religion, and the freedom to express yourself in different ways. There are so many different issues that are coming up, and some of them have kind of simmered down and they're out of the spotlight, but it doesn't mean that they're not important. They may be really important to you. Other issues are rightfully so in the spotlight, and they may be quite urgent to you. But I encourage you to think through each of those, and I'm happy to release a list of those topics online. But think through, out of score of 10, how important is each of these to you? And out of score of 10, what would you give each person who is running for it? And maybe they don't cover it at all. Maybe they haven't thought about it. Maybe they deserve a 0. You can figure that out yourself. But that at least gives you some sort of weighting about it. And remember that this is all in the context of what is the sort of Australia that I would like to grow up in, or grow old in, or have my kids grow old in. I hope that's useful for you. Please feel free to give me feedback. I've tried to be as non-partisan as possible, because I just don't think that that's particularly helpful to be ramming down anyone's political persuasion down anyone else's throat. I think if you can own your own vote and feel really convicted about that, then that's great. Go and make your vote on Saturday. Get your democracy sausage, even if it's a vegan democracy sausage. And I hope that, this is a really useful tool for you, but more importantly, that we can continue to build an Australia together that is united and that actually cares for one another, and can deliver things with integrity and with competence. Okay, take care.